Welcome to Polish Insights on Global Affairs with the Polish Institute of International Affairs, PISM, in short, a think tank. This is a go-to-go source for expert perspectives on the most pressing developments in the world politics and security. I'm Agnieszka Bielawska, your host, and joining me is PISM expert Artur Kacprzyk. And in today's episode, we're turning our attention to the end of the New START and the end of START. The United States and Russia no longer have limits on their nuclear arsenals. What exactly was the START agreement?
So first of all, thanks for having me. The New START agreement was one of the series of agreements made since the early 70s between the United States and then the Soviet Union, now Russia, which initially limited, so initially, they were intended to stop the increase in nuclear forces. And then, since the first START treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which was the first one was signed in 1991, and the New START was signed in 2010. It was the successor to the first START. They were intended to actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons that both countries had. And precisely, these agreements covered the so-called strategic nuclear weapons. So in other words, nuclear systems which have an intercontinental range. So basically nuclear weapons which can reach North America from Russia or Soviet Union and the other way around. And these treaties, they helped to first constrain the nuclear arms race and then to lower the number of warheads. Because, on the one hand, if you look at the number of warheads that today the US and Russia have, it's around 4,000 each, which is a lot, definitely. It's 90% of together they have the 90% of the combined, number of warheads globally. But during the Cold War, at its peak, both countries had around 25 to 30,000 warheads. So there was a significant reduction, even though there are still many weapons out there. And New START specifically, the ceilings included in that treaty stipulated that each country can have up to 1,550 nuclear warheads deployed on these intercontinental range systems, so ballistic missiles launched from land or submarines and long-range bombers.
So that includes also submarines, sorry.
That also includes intercontinental range missiles launched from submarines, yes, which are actually the majority of nuclear force in case of DS, but also a big piece of the Russian nuclear force, although in case of Russia, most of that strategic nuclear force is based on land. So again, important to remember that that treaty has not covered all the types of nuclear weapons. It hasn't covered the so-called, some would say, non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. I prefer to call them short and medium-range nuclear weapons because any use of nuclear weapons after all these decades since Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be strategic, at least politically. But by that, I mean the weapons which don't have the range to reach North America from Russia, but they can reach US allies in Europe and Asia. And Russia has a much bigger arsenal of this kind than the United States, but also NATO in general, because you have around 200 of these warheads on the US side, some 50 on the French side, but 1,000, 2,000, maybe more on the Russian side. Which again, I don't want to dwell too much into history, but then you must remember that during the Cold War, it was the West which was at the conventional disadvantage towards Russia, like the Russia or Soviet Union actually. So the Soviet Union and its subordinated countries of Warsaw Pact had numerical superiority over NATO armies. So back then, NATO assumed that they might have to use nuclear weapons first on the battlefield to try to stop an invasion from the East. And at that time, the West also had lots of these shorter range nuclear weapons. But it got rid of most of that after the Cold War because Soviet Union, then Russia, was first of all not seen as an enemy by many in NATO, and it got weaker. Russians, on the other side, they felt to be at the disadvantage towards the West in conventional armies, conventional weapons. So they kept a large arsenal of these shorter range weapons. And actually, in recent years, you see not only Russians keeping those weapons for deterrence, but unfortunately also expanding the number of systems that carry those weapons and using those weapons, not using in sense of detonating them, but exploiting them for aggressive purposes. Many times during the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we have seen Russia kind of brandishing nuclear weapons, including those short-term range weapons, for example, by staging sudden exercises near NATO or Ukraine borders to basically threaten the West and send the signal, do not help Ukraine. So this would be, I think, all the most important information as regards, the basic, what start covered or not, and what is the, main differences between Russia and the West. But then, and I will stop here, you also need to bring China into this conversation.
Well, yes, because why was this agreement restrictive or not? That is a question again. Why was it terminated? Why on February the 5th all this came to an end? Because on the one hand, Trump wanted China to join such an agreement. On the other, Putin said that there are European also, well, maybe not nuclear powers, but still countries that do possess nuclear weapons also should be joining. Why did it come to an end?
I think it was the combination of, first of all, emergence of China as the third biggest nuclear armed country, but also the fact that the New START was not really functioning fully for a couple of years. So as regards China has a much smaller nuclear force than US and Russia, but it is growing rapidly. According to US estimates, the Chinese nuclear force has grown from around 200 weapons 5 years ago to some 600 right now. And they are supposed to be heading to 1,000 warheads by 2030 and probably more after that. And since China is now the main competitor of the US, US cares a lot about what's going on with Chinese nuclear force. And actually, it felt that, I think that's what we are going to see and hear soon. We are likely to see US increasing nuclear forces to counter Russia and China, but first of all, to counter this Chinese buildup. And the thinking of many people in the US was that if China doesn't want to join an arms control agreement, the US needs to build up, and it can't if it's constrained by the New START treaty. But then again, that's one part of the story. The other one is that actually Russia suspended New START treaty after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, after 2022. So since 2022, the Russians have not been accepting inspections of their nuclear forces under this treaty, and since 2023, the Russians have not been exchanging information about this strategic nuclear forces. So basically, the verification regime of the treaty was suspended, which made it much more difficult to actually confirm whether the Russians are respecting the limits of the treaty. Aren't they increasing the forces above that? Because you can do that with national intelligence means, especially satellites. Obviously, it's much easier, much more reliable if you can send a team down there to a nuclear base and, for example, count how many warheads are on a missile. And the Russians did this. They named a number of reasons, but the main one was that US is supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia. So by doing this, the Russians wanted to, again, intimidate the West with the threat of some sort of arms race or escalation and nuclear war. They wanted to portray this as the risk of nuclear war getting higher. So they were basically saying, if you want this treaty to function fully, just stop supporting Ukraine. And even though at the very end, it was now during the Trump's first year, during his second term, shortly before the expiration of the treaty, because we should start by saying that it basically would expire because it was signed in 2010, ratified 1 year later. It was by law supposed to function for 10 years. Then the Biden administration and the Russians in 2021 extended it for 5 years, and legally it could not have been extended anymore. But what Russians have been saying recently, Putin was basically saying, okay, we cannot extend it formally, but we can say, we can declare, as presidents of US and Russia, Putin and Trump, that we will honor this agreement still.
But still, Putin did not hesitate, threatening to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine.
Of course, and he basically said what would be a sort of gentleman's agreement that both sides say they will respect the treaty, but there will be no verification, and obviously trusting Putin is a folly, to put it mildly.
So are we in for an arms race? I mean, Donald Trump said recently, following, I think, the termination of the agreement, that both the United States and Russia, you said they have some 90% of the nuclear weapons of the world, that they have mounted such enormous potential that it can annihilate the whole world if used. Is this a sign that they will be again racing who has more, who has better, including China?
I think we are already in an arms race. It's only now that the US is joining it because, as we discussed, we've seen China increasing its nuclear forces. We've seen Russia increasing them as well, not to the same extent as China does, but deploying these new kinds of short and medium range systems, like, for example, the Oreshnik ballistic missile, which was used to strike Ukraine with conventional payloads, but it can carry nuclear warheads as well. You see also Russians, by the way, working on so-called exotic intercontinental range nuclear systems. So not traditional aircraft and ballistic missiles, but nuclear-powered torpedoes or cruise missiles, which were not covered by the treaty directly, but can still hit the United States. So you've seen the rivals of the US building more nuclear weapons. Now US feels it needs to deploy additional ones, unless there's a new treaty, as President Trump says he wants it, but it's not achievable at this point to have a treaty with US, Russia, and China involved, because China continues to say that China has much less nuclear weapons than Russia and the United States. They see no reason to join it. So probably, maybe, if the idea is to have that one big new arms control treaty, maybe it will happen only if China gets much closer to US and Russian arsenals, which will take a long time, but it might happen. Actually, most of these Chinese nuclear weapons are long-range ones, so the ones that would be covered by New START. So if they get to 1,000 of such weapons by 2030, well, it will be somehow closer to New START. But again, you might have a race with the US and Russia also increasing. And then on the Russian side, I think there will always be a problem for us that Russia really doesn't want to in any way constrain those shorter and medium range systems, because it sees them as its own big advantage, and it sees that NATO has not equivalent force that it can trade numerically in such a treaty. So unless President Trump surprises us and comes up with something unconventional and maybe something else that his own, negotiators and advisors want to have, I don't really see any new arms control treaty happening in the short term, at least in a few years. Speaking of the arms race, it's not, and I think it will be not, the kind of the arms race you've seen in the Cold War. I think it's important to stress that, in the sense that it would not be the same scale. You won't see countries adding a couple of thousand warheads in a couple of years, because all the countries also have other priorities, right? The Russians, obviously, the focus right now is to finance the war against Ukraine. For the Americans, in such a race, Americans obviously would be in much better place than the Russians, because the US economy is so much bigger. But the Americans in military affairs are also focusing on non-nuclear, conventional weapons, because they want to prepare for a potential conflict with China in the Indo-Pacific. So I don't think there will be a massive build-up shortly after the expiration of the treaty. What I think will happen is that the US and Russia will bring out some warheads from reserve, from the magazines, and put them on the already existing missiles and bombers. So I think this is something that will be happening in the nearest 2-3 years.
And where do the European nuclear powers come in this game? France, the United Kingdom, they have, I think, quite recently come up with the Northwood Declaration.
Right.
So they are also joining?
This is a great question because it shows how complicated the nuclear landscape is, even if you just look at the Russia and China versus the West kind of equation. Well, naturally, United Kingdom and France, they have even less nuclear weapons than China. Combined, they have, I think, around 550 nuclear warheads. So they don't want to be in any kind of arms control agreement already, because they already think their arsenals have been lowered, in terms of numbers. But Northwood Declaration that you mentioned is important in the sense that it is supposed to show that both of these countries want to play a bigger role in European security with their nuclear forces. It basically is supposed to communicate to other allies like Poland that French and British nuclear weapons are not only for protection of their own homelands, which has been the case especially with France, that this was obviously most of that arsenal is supposed to be used if France is attacked. But now they are communicating that, in some circumstances, extreme circumstances, and you can guess what that is, they might think and they might actually use nuclear weapons to defend allies. And this, I think, has to do with, in part, with transatlantic tensions and the uncertainty, what will be the future US involvement in NATO, how credible that involvement will be. Although the French and the British, they don't want to replace the US. For now, they want to better supplement it, right? So, to send a signal to the Russians that, if you attack NATO with nuclear weapons, you have to think about US reaction, but not only about that, but also about French and British reaction as well. It's a way to complicate Russian calculations. So they want to supplement the US. But at the same time, a part of the idea is to better supplement the US because of the uncertainty about US credibility, but also because of the things we also discussed today, in the sense that the US will be more and more focusing on the threat from China. So if you imagine a situation in which US is fighting China in the Pacific, and then you have also Russian aggression in Europe, the Russians might doubt whether the US will, be willing to risk two wars at the same time, or maybe will it even have enough forces to respond to some sort of nuclear use by the Russians in Europe when fighting China. So it has also to do with that, to show that US is important, but there are also others who can theoretically respond.
This is what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about the implications of the end of START for Poland. I mean, you said about France and the UK, so this may be, a very small light in the tunnel to calm our anxieties, but still we are in the middle of a conflict, and not only in the sense geographically, but also in the sense that we are threatened with what is happening outside our eastern border.
Sure. So in terms of the New START expiring, I don't see any short-term direct effect on Europe, in the sense that, as we talked about, it did not constrain those short and medium range weapons, which are especially threatening to us. There might be actually a good thing coming out of this, if you ask about alliance politics and deterrence of Russia, in the sense that it is a signal that the US is seriously thinking about the possibility of having to fight both China and Russia at the same time, which is why it needs more nuclear warheads to respond to what these countries have been doing. So in that sense, it does send a signal from the US that it is thinking seriously about some very grim scenarios, but scenarios which most likely would arise if either of its rivals or both of its rivals would attack allies, right? So it is, I think, a signal that Russia doesn't like. And even in that political sense, it might turn out to be good for NATO's deterrence. But there are many questions as regards START. I think because, as we said, the first round of that arms race is probably going to be pretty limited. But, in the next decade, in the 30s, depending what all these nations involved in this do, you might see much bigger armaments on both sides, these strategic long-range, armaments. And it's difficult to predict, where will it lead, in the sense that you might see Russia, for example, spending more on that rather than on forces which threaten Europe, which would be a good thing for NATO. But you might also see the Americans also trying to save resources to spend more on those long-range weapons and maybe cut its American presence in Europe, which they are going to do, but by what the Trump administration is signaling anyhow, it's just the question of how fast and to what extent, because they want the Europeans to cover more of the burden. So I think that in the nuclear domain, Europeans definitely need to contribute more to nuclear deterrence. We talked about France and the UK. There are ways in which they can signal that, not just signing declarations, but maybe having the French exercises of their nuclear aircraft, nuclear armed aircraft, not just over France, but maybe over countries of eastern flank like Poland, which would be a political signal that this umbrella extends further east. And I think there are ways to be done by the countries which do not have nuclear weapons. On one hand, there is such a thing which is called nuclear sharing in NATO, which basically means that the US deploys nuclear weapons in Europe, and some allies like Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, soon United Kingdom have aircraft which could carry those weapons if the US allowed for it. So it is an instrument of, let's say, sharing burdens, right, of nuclear deterrence. Theoretically, expanding it would strengthen, the NATO's European ability to also respond to Russian nuclear attack in military sense. So, for example, if you had Polish fighter aircraft certified and pilots trained for carrying those weapons, it means that such aircraft are in Europe, and it would be more difficult for the Russians to basically take them out and prevent any kind of retaliation. But again, this is a controversial issue. I mean, in NATO, I think, especially as regards stationing nuclear weapons further east, US nuclear weapons, Poland several times signaled it would like that to happen, but last year we've heard the vice president of the US, J.D. Vance, saying that, well, it would be escalatory towards Russia. So at least at this point, I don't think US is ready for that, and some European allies are ready for that. As the arms race escalates in the future, maybe that might change. But this is one way to actually contribute more. The other way is for countries like Poland to invest more in the deep strike capabilities, by which I mean weapons which can reach 1,000 kilometers and more into Russia, but conventional ones. And actually, if you hear what the NATO, also Polish, high-level military officials are saying, we already need them. And you see why. If you look at how the Ukraine's defense from Russia is going, because Russia is a big country, and they have forces like bomber bases or arms factories deep in their territory, and you need to reach there if you need to defend yourself. So we need those weapons anyway, and Europeans are working on those weapons anyway. But I would say that it needs to be done faster. And you can see that in terms of nuclear deterrence, in some situations, if Europe has lots of these long-range, conventional but very precise weapons, and Russia uses a small number of nuclear weapons, right? It may be that in some situations we could respond really forcefully just with conventional weapons. If you strike, critical infrastructure like power plants, it can be really hurtful. It would not totally replace nuclear weapons, because Russians can escalate, so you still have nuclear weapons on your own or an ally to extend that deterrence towards you. But it would give more options to Europe, and it would raise the risks of war to the Russians, I'd say. Now, the elephant in the room, and I will stop there, is obviously the question, should more countries have nuclear weapons?
And this is what I wanted to finalize our talk with. And that is, we've been focusing on the United States, on Europe, Russia, and on China. But there are other countries like India, like Israel. Well, I won't be talking about North Korea, but isn't this end of the New START program an impulse for them too?
I wouldn't say an impulse, but you might see the secondary effect of increased deployments of nuclear weapons among US, Russia, and China. So you might see, for example, US increasing nuclear weapons in response to China's buildup, then Russia increasing additionally, they have been increasing anyway, but additionally increasing nuclear weapons in response to US deployments. Then China might respond to either of that, or they might just build because they might have their own reasons for building that, for example, to underscore that they are a superpower, akin to the US and Russia, and they might need lots of nuclear weapons for that reason. That's entirely, I think, different story and entirely different threat, maybe for another conversation, as what the Chinese thinking is. But then you will have countries looking at what China does, and especially India, I think, at some point also feel, or at least consider, the need to increase its own nuclear force to respond to what China is doing. And then if India responds, then Pakistan might respond. And you already see India and Pakistan slowly but building up those nuclear weapons. So I don't think that exploration of New START will dramatically change the landscape, because these armaments are increasing and they are going on, but it might accelerate them.
Artur Kacprzyk, expert of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, was my guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.